Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In his lecture, What is Metaphysics?, Heidegger talks quite a bit about anxiety, which is a mood or attunement, and it's a fundamental one. It's the one which allows us best as human beings to relate ourselves to this fundamental metaphysical, whatever we want to call it, principle, reality, thing we have to take into account of the nothing that Heidegger thinks has been primarily overlooked throughout the history of previous metaphysics, in which he's trying to bring to our attention in an original way. And he talks about what he calls original anxiety as that which places us in relation to the beings as they are receding from us, and the nothing has us realize our place within the totality of beings. There's all of that, and I've talked about that in other places. Here, what we want to focus on is the relationship between what he calls original anxiety and the everydayness in which we ignore or repress or find ways to distract ourselves from this original anxiety. So, another way of thinking about this is, well, if this anxiety is so fundamental, why aren't we feeling it? Why aren't we registering it, not just affectively, but cognitively in our lives all the time? And Heidegger says, well, it's churning away under the surface for most people, but generally it's repressed, or we find ways to distract ourselves from it so that we don't feel it, so that we don't think it, so that we don't experience it, and thereby don't have to deal with the nothing, and also, by correlation, don't have to think in terms of the fullness of our freedom, or other things that are going along with that, even the notion of selfhood, or he doesn't use the term here, but he will in many other places, authenticity. So if we realize what is going on, not just within beings as a totality, but also in ourselves as Dasein, as being there, as being held out into the nothing, we are going to experience that through anxiety. Heidegger talks about ways in which we can evade this distraction. He's going to detail a number of different modes of distractedness in being and time. And what this produces is a distorted or even an eclipsed view of the nothing. There is no nothing that's being paid attention to. Instead, what we have is a preoccupation with beings. So, I'll just give you a few examples of what this might look like, even though he doesn't provide these here in What is Metaphysics. One thing that Heidegger does talk about in Being and Time is what he calls empty chatter. This constant chattering about, things that are rather ephemeral, not very important. We might think of a large part of social media today as exemplifying what Heidegger calls empty chatter. The obsession with celebrities and what they're up to, the listicles that people put together, particularly if they're about politicians or about, other types of, if you think about it, politicians these days really are, except insofar as they do any actual work, celebrities, right? And that is one mode of distracting ourselves from what's really going on in our lives, from what really fundamentally matters. And people can do this, over and over and over again. They're enabled by living in a culture which constantly churns this stuff out for them. Other ways could be through, various forms of becoming obsessed with a particular region of beings, losing yourself, as we say in that. It could be anything from collecting stamps to collecting relationships, to collecting experiences. Right? We could come up with many other interesting examples, but in all cases there's sort of a preoccupation with beings and a loss of the grasp of being itself. And Heidegger tells us that in anxiety, something else is happening. He talks about this as a bewildered calm that takes place on our part. And, we don't see, but we grasp the nothing in this. So, here we go, a little bit further on. He says, how is it then that we don't feel this anxiety except in rare moments? He says, we lose ourselves altogether among beings in a certain way. The more we turn towards beings in our preoccupations, the less we let beings as a whole slip away as such, and the more we turn away from the nothing. Just as surely do we hasten into the public superficies, that is the little top areas of existence. So by allowing ourselves to be dazzled or brought in or seduced by these regions of being, the things at the superficial level, we lose our possibility of grasping the depths. And he goes on and he talks about the anxiety still being there for us. He's got these beautiful, very short phenomenological analyses. He says, anxiety is there. It is only sleeping. Its breath quivers perpetually through Dasein, only slightly in those who are jittery, imperceptibly in the oh yes and oh no of men of affairs, that is, people who are concerned with business, right? Whether that business be running a university or canvassing for votes or writing up little things in social media, whatever it is, the oh yes and oh no. And then he says, most readily in the reserved and most assuredly in those who are basically daring. Heidegger is not spelling this out in any sort of thematic way here, but there's really two main, you could say, ways in which anxiety breaks out and offers itself to us as Dasein. He talks about occasions, and then he talks about what we can call comportments. So the reserved and the daring are two types of comportments. They're ways in which we relate ourselves to the world. And we'll talk about those in just a moment. Let's talk about occasions first. So Heidegger says you don't need any super special occasion. You don't actually have to go to somebody who specializes in awakening Heideggerian anxiety the way certain psychoanalysts set themselves up to do, or I suppose there's probably some self-help gurus out there doing that as well. There's a lot of people who've made a lot of hay out of Heidegger on this point. He says, original anxiety can awaken in existence at any moment. It needs no unusual event to rouse it. Its sway is as thoroughgoing as its possible occasionings are trivial. It is always ready, though it only seldom springs, and we are snatched away and left hanging. It's a constant possibility for us. We don't need some sort of earth-shaking event in order to spark this anxiety and to get us feeling that. It could be as trivial as running out of cigarettes and wondering, should I still be smoking? I don't know. I'm 40 years old, and what does it mean to be 40 years old? And this line of thinking, and eventually we have an existential crisis, right? When we have an existential crisis, that is, from a Heideggerian perspective, the anxiety coming to the fore. And it can happen through, momentous things like losing a job, the death of a loved one, the breakdown of a relationship, finding out that the political party that you hitched your wagon to because you thought they were going to produce utopia on earth has left you and all your compatriots in the dust. Those sorts of things can be big things, but it can be as simple as running out of shampoo, or looking out the window and seeing something that puzzles you, or having dinner with somebody who gives an offhand remark that you then think about. So occasions open up, you might say, the pores within the everyday through which anxiety can intrude itself. Intrude itself rightly, because anxiety is more original than the everyday. Now, we also have these comportments, right? Heidegger does not tell us that much about the reserved, but he does tell us some things about the daring that are quite interesting. This might make us think about the nature of creativity and risk. So Heidegger tells us, those who are basically daring. He says those daring ones are sustained by that on which they expend themselves. They are sustained by that on which they expend themselves. So if they're a musician, it is the music and the instrument and the audience that is listening to it. If they are artists, working with visual things, it's those means. If it's all sorts of other ways in which people are daring, you could be daring, for example, in business. This is what real entrepreneurship is about taking risks, about producing something new that has genuine value, not just hopping on a trend and saying, oh, well, such and such is hot, I'll, slap a label on that and, regurgitate some business school quotes, and now I've got a product. That's not being daring. That's being safe. Being daring would be something like, I don't know, saying that philosophy could matter for ordinary people and going out and doing it. Or thinking that I'll take on a big corporation because even though they have all this power and all these people working for them, they're not fulfilling this need here that people genuinely have. Or if we think about in terms of education, throwing off some of the shackles of modern educational theory and getting back to what education ought to be, but not doing so in a way that's only good for the elites. We could come up with lots of examples. All of them involve risk. All of them involve an immersion in what it is that you're being daring about. So he says the daring ones are sustained, right? In order thus to preserve the ultimate grandeur of existence. They are contributing something to existence. This is why we are attracted to people who are genuinely innovative, not just the people who talk about innovation or thought leadership or stuff like that, or do TED Talks. The people where we see it's the real deal, because they are what Heidegger calls daring. And he goes on and he says, the anxiety of those who are daring. Now, this might throw you. Wait a second, those who are daring, don't they proceed without anxiety? No, they proceed through anxiety. They proceed despite anxiety. They are engaged in what in other places we call courage, which does not mean a lack of fear, but a dealing with the fear in some sort of reasonable and necessary way in order to attain something that is good. And so he says, the anxiety of those who are daring cannot be opposed to joy, or even to the comfortable enjoyment of tranquilized bustle. It stands outside all such opposition in secret alliance with the cheerfulness and gentleness of creative longing. Isn't that a beautiful turn of phrase? It stands in secret alliance with the cheerfulness and gentleness of creative longing. This is a comportment that Heidegger thinks is one by which a human being could be more genuine, more authentic, because they are more in touch with the anxiety that pervades all of human existence, this original anxiety, and they do things in the world. They don't just retreat from the world. Even the reserved don't simply retreat from the world. The reserved are, engaged in saying, this matters, not this. The daring are doing something a bit different. They are bringing something new in. Heidegger uses that word creative, I think, quite deliberately. So all of this is how original anxiety can be experienced and lived out.